Incoterms do not address transfer of ownership from seller to buyer. And people make the assumption that if I, as the seller, transfer possession to you, and if I transfer risk to you, you own the goods. And you don't.
Hi everyone, are you loving our podcast? Do you feel like watching instead of just listening to our episodes? We have started to share our podcast videos on our trade community, www.crowd.trade, where you can view the complete show, comment, and carry conversations with your peers. We have built a trade community around our training courses and different resources for you to collaborate and gain the knowledge you are looking for. Head over to crowd.trade and register for your free account. Let's start trading.
Well, Lalo, it is coming to the end of the year, and we've had a phenomenal run so far. We can't say we've been going for the whole year. I guess we've been going, 4 months, 5 months that we've been publishing shows?
August. So August. So yeah. So 5 months.
September,
and
November, December.
I didn't.
Yeah, 5 months. Yeah, it's like, hey, I'm part of that, down home school system here. 1, 2, 3.
I know. I have that same problem. I can't go past 10. So,
well, I got to say, we keep emphasizing it, man. To our listeners, y'all have been fantastic. The surprise, I guess, for us as we've been firing up is not only are we trending up here in the U.S. and we're continuing to do so, but in Europe, oh my gosh, it's like we've got some, both of you and I think have some international contacts, global contacts that seem to be interested in what we're doing, and they're spreading the word out there. So, but I had an interesting conversation with somebody just yesterday that was interested in our podcast. Actually, I talked to them 2 days ago, and they talked to me again yesterday, and they have forwarded the link to our podcast to several of their family members and friends, because they're like, hey, they're all interested in this logistics realm and all that. So it's very humbling. I got to tell you, it's been fantastic.
Right. But, and then earlier, I would say a couple of weeks ago, we published our first Spanish show, all in Spanish, and that one went really well, to be honest with you.
Yes.
It took off and did really good. The next day we did the English version, which also did good, but I was really happy to see that our Spanish show trended really well in Mexico. And so, I mean, who knows what we'll do next? I mean,
well, to our listeners, again, I don't speak Spanish. The Spanish that I know, I can't repeat publicly, so it's one of those. But that all said, hey, listen, folks, if especially to your Spanish-speaking counterparts, and if you're doing business in Mexico, that is a fantastic show to listen to. So make a point to do that.
Yeah.
Well, it actually kind of goes hand in hand as far as what we were talking on. That is what we're going to be talking about today. I got to tell you, and what we're getting into today is the proverbial term Incoterms. If you don't know what that is, international term, commercial terms of sale. Excuse me. And of that, it's like in just a 3-letter code, it can determine who's responsible for what: the buyer, the seller, the shipper, the exporter, the importer, yada, yada. So we're going to get into some good discussions, but there's always a lot of confusion with, because I'll ask somebody as we've consulted and talked to folks, what are your terms? And they'll go, oh, net 30. Oh, no, or net 15 or whatever. Like, no, not payment terms.
Or all the FOBs, right?
Yeah. Well, everything's FOB. Yeah. So, well, we have somebody that I'm looking forward to him giving us some guidance here, because as I've said, it's like I'd screw up a 2-car parade when it comes to some of this stuff, and hopefully I can get through and he can put me on the straight and narrow when it comes to the Incoterms and how to approach it. But Lalo, why don't you introduce our guest today?
Sure. So we have on our show, his name is Arthur O'Mara, and he is certified by the ICC, by the way, who writes or who's owns, he'll tell us better, the Incoterms, amongst other stuff. But he also teaches for Global Training Center. He does several courses. he is an author. His name is Arthur, but he's an author of Incoterms.
Say that 3 times
Yeah, I
there,
know,
buddy.
exactly. Sorry, tongue tied there a little. So anyway, he is an author of Incoterms books as well, and he'll let us know a little bit more about that. But even though, if just so we can cover the content, if we do skip over some of that, not to worry. Again, everybody knows to check the show notes, because there's a bio of him, and links to his profile and whatnot. Whatever else that we might find of his, we'll link to that. But anyway, Arthur, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and very last show of the year. We're happy to have you, and maybe we can go through some stuff that people can prepare for 2023. Anything you might have seen in 2022 that might have been problems. First of all, let me also say this. We do need to clarify something. People always call Global Training Center, hey, when are you going to have the Incoterms 2023 training or Incoterms 2022? It's like, no. So anyway, let's start with something like that.
Okay. So let's start with Incoterms 2023 versus Incoterms 2020. and I think what we need to get, because if you Google Incoterms 2023, things pop up, right?
Yes, they do.
And invariably, it's just people in marketing who are like, let's just put it out there. But Incoterms are published every few years. Nothing in writing states how often it must be, but the latest version is Incoterms 2020. So here we are, end of 2022, just about to embark on 2023, and the latest version is Incoterms 2020, and the previous version was Incoterms 2010, and then Incoterms 2000, and Incoterms 1990. And there's nothing in writing.
Yeah, they try and do it every 10 years is the frequency,
right.
is where the ICC tries. By the way, let me stop for a second. And again, welcome, Arthur, to our show. For those that heard ICC, that stands for International Chamber of Commerce. It's actually headquartered in Paris, France. And it is the entity that has the copyrights and is who originally generates, if you will, through different people that contribute, and publishes the actual Incoterms. So they're the ones that have the standard out there. But then since that, there's also a lot of supportive things. And I quite frankly, Arthur, as we're going through this, I'm going to tell you, Incoterms, with the information that's initially out there and you read through it, it's clear as mud. So it's like, you're going to have to help us here. So it's like,
okay, I can summarize it very quickly. First of all, let me state, Andy, that you're 100% correct. Incoterms is an acronym. It stands for International Commerce Terms, and there is an appropriate way to write it, and that's with a capital I, and the rest of the letters are lowercase. One of my pet peeves is, the capital Inco -terms, and no, it's one word, capital I. The rest of the word is lowercase. Got to put the little R in the circle. It is an internationally registered trademark as well.
right.
Yes, the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris publishes these. And let me give it to you in one sentence. International Chamber of Commerce. So the Incoterms represent shorthand for identifying the transfer of risk and possession from seller to buyer.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Okay. There is a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there. There are a lot of things that Incoterms do not address. People try to tie them into the Incoterms. It doesn't work. It makes things a little bit sloppy. But when I talk about risk and possession, risk means responsibility for the condition of the goods during the move. So at some point, Andy, if I'm going to sell to you, I'm going to be responsible for the goods up to a certain point, and then you pick up responsibility after that point, and the identification of that point is defined by the Incoterms. And then possession. Well, let's talk about possession. We have to talk about possession. When I say possession, I don't mean physical possession. I mean, I don't own an airplane, okay, and I don't own a container ship. But if I'm going to sell it to you, I'm going to have to hire a company with a truck, maybe hire a company with an airplane. And when I hire these agents to move the goods, these agents become my legal representative. So as long as the goods are in the possession of my agent, they're in my legal possession, but they're not in my physical possession. And at some point, possession is going to transfer from my agent to your agent, which means it transfers from me to you, and that's going to be defined by the Incoterms rule that is used between seller and buyer. That's
Well,
it.
as you're going through this, let me say this, especially for those is like if you're at an executive level, middle management to upper management, one of the things I want to reach out to you here, this may be one of those is like, oh man, this is not really what I want to get into or whatever. Don't touch that dial yet. Here's the thing. From an executive level, too often your own bureaucracy of your company, people are creatures of habit and they can default to the wrong Incoterm. And when you're dealing with an international transaction of some kind of a sale, even if there's not a sale involved, it's just a movement of goods from one location to another. There's going to be appropriate Incoterms for that. But here's what's important. At an executive level, you need to be looking at this because you can lose out in a international trade or international court of law on a transaction if the wrong Incoterm is utilized, because you can have a contract negotiated and certain people are supposed to be following through with certain responsibilities, Arthur, as you just mentioned, and yet at the same time the paperwork has a different Incoterm on it or whatever. That changes it because that international transaction is for that shipment is tied to the paperwork, the bill of lading, the commercial invoice, maybe a letter of instruction, or whatever else. And if you could supersede your contract with what's on that paperwork for that international transaction. So it's important from an executive level that as you're looking at this, you don't need to necessarily understand all the minutia here. But what you do need to do is ask the questions of your accounting folks, your purchasing folks, and especially your compliance folks, and do a review of some of that. And it's like, what should be the proper Incoterms? So we can get into that, Arthur, on some of this. But what about some of the things in approaching here? We can talk about, the proper things one way or another, but let's just go right to something. What do you see as one of the, shall we say, most common
misused
abuses or misuses of an Incoterm?
Sure. Title transfer. Okay. Ownership. Incoterms do not address transfer of ownership from seller to buyer. And people make the assumption that if I, as the seller, transfer possession to you, and if I transfer risk to you, you own the goods, and you don't. And so it very well may be that I may be responsible for goods I don't own, or you may be responsible for goods you don't possess. Incoterms do not address title transfer, never have, never will. Title transfer must be addressed separately in your terms and conditions. And people get confused when they think about the transfer of possession and risk, and they equate it with the transfer of title. Completely separate conversations, because generally transfer of title is associated with payment for the goods. Incoterms will not deal with payment for the goods. The only thing the Incoterms say is, if I, as the seller, do what I'm supposed to do, you as the buyer are obligated to pay for the goods. How and when you pay for the goods is a separate conversation. Now, this comes into play when we look at where the goods reside, on your books or on my books. All right. And so we've got to look at the ownership of risk, and can we quantify that in our either in our landed cost or when we build a sale price, right? Because the name of the game is to maximize profit here. And the old school way of thinking was, hey, I'm in the business of making widgets. I make all my suppliers bring the goods to me. I make all my customers pick the goods up at my door. And you are leaving money on the table when you do that. Because in today's very small world, the companies that succeed are the companies that are best at moving goods and managing risk. And I don't think I can overstate the importance of managing risk in 2020, 2021, and 2022, when our supply chain basically exploded. I mean,
well, let's give some scenarios here. Is like, because you're going down a really good road here.
Hi everyone, are you loving our podcast? Do you feel like watching instead of just listening to our episodes? We have started to share our podcast videos on our trade community, www.crowd.trade, where you can view the complete show, comment, and carry conversations with your peers. We have built a trade community around our training courses and different resources for you to collaborate and gain the knowledge you are looking for. Head over to crowd.trade and register for your free account. Let's start trading.
Let's just say a factory again. China's been a very common one. Vietnam's the next big growth thing. Taiwan would be another one. So let's talk and give a scenario where there is a bulk of widgets that a factory in Asia is, and it could be in Europe as well, it doesn't matter, but we'll just say Asia right now. And let's just use Taiwan as the scenario that they are loading up containers that are put onto a ship, heading to the U.S. for distribution across the U.S. And in that is that as they're going through, one of the most common Incoterms that's used is FOB, free on board. What does that mean? I mean, it's that kind of stuff and all that. And so why don't we talk through the most common uses, and then I'd like to throw a couple of exceptions at you and say, now, what about this and what should they be looking at?
Okay. FOB, one of my favorite subjects. Americans love to run around going FOB, FOB, FOB. And
right.
And for domestic transactions in the United States, that's perfectly acceptable. We have the Uniform Commercial Code. In our UCC, we have American Domestic Trade Terms, and one of them is FOB. And there are 6 variations of FOB, multimodal transportation, domestic use as well. Couldn't be more different from the Incoterms FOB. Now, the Incoterms FOB very specifically is intended for movement by ocean. Most people know that, but what they don't realize is if your goods are moving on a container, you really should not be using FOB. You should be using FCA instead. And so the misuse of FOB, here's the problem, Andy. If you've been in your job for a while, pretty soon you get to a point where any problem that lands on your desk, you can fix it with a phone call or an email. No one has to call the lawyers and dig up the paperwork. And if the paperwork is wrong and it's been wrong for years, it doesn't matter because I just pick up the phone, I call you, you say, yeah, I know what you meant. And I say, yeah, I know what you meant. We fix it, we move on. The paperwork is wrong forever. And then one day we can't fix it. And now we dig up the paperwork and it says FOB. And the arbiters have to try to figure out what we intended because our intentions are not reflected in our paperwork, right?
Right.
And so theoretically, let's just say that you and I did some business. I'm in Taiwan, you're in the United States, I'm selling to you. Under Incoterms FCA, we load up a bunch of containers, and the container ship is attacked by a sea monster halfway across. I mean, it could happen.
Yes.
We
no, actually, that's one of the exceptions I'm going to throw because it has happened where, as we've seen, there have been, believe it or not, container ships that have collided in mid-ocean. I'm like, it must have been foggy or something. I don't know. Secondly, there's been fires that have broken out, and they've had to literally dump some of the containers off to try and protect the rest, not only the ship, but then some of the containers. Storms, whatever, some of the things then, or the ship itself has gone down. But there's been a lot of exceptions. So, so I've got containers of widgets, and you're selling to me, and let's just say that the containers now with our goods that in this transaction have gone overboard.
Okay. Now, if I sold to you under FCA, guess what? Risk transfers from me to you in Taiwan. All right. You own the risk. Now, what if you and I have negotiated a deal where you get net 90? I'm giving you very generous payment terms. The goods are going to arrive probably at your location before you even pay for them, before you even own them. So the goods are going to stay on my books all the way until they get to your receiving dock. They're going to be on my books, but you're going to own the risk. And consequently, who has to clean up the mess? Well, under FCA, risk transfers from seller to buyer in the seller's country. And so the buyer owns the risk. And if the containers go overboard, well, the buyer's got to clean up the mess, even though the buyer doesn't really own the goods.
Okay. So as soon as the carrier who's transporting those goods takes possession of that container, risk now transferred. Well, that means that if there's a problem along the way, hey, where's my container, whatever, the buyer is responsible for tracing that or reaching out to the carrier or filing a claim or saying, what do you mean my container is in the ocean, whatever, those kinds of things. So that's what I wanted to clarify. If I got that correct.
You're right. You do. So in our example, when that container backs up to my shipping dock, as soon as those goods are loaded into that container from my shipping dock, boom, risk transfers from me to you. Okay, and at that point, possession transfers as well. Remember, because although you're in the United States, you've hired a company who's hired a company who's hired a trucker in Taiwan. That trucker is an agent of an agent of an agent of you. And so now the goods are in your legal possession the minute they're loaded onto that truck in Taiwan.
Right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
Now, you may not own the goods, you may. I don't know. That's a separate conversation. The thing here is that, like I said, Americans love to run around saying FOB, FOB, FOB. It's just we've gotten away with it for decades because we have these American domestic trade terms. They don't have them in Mexico. They don't have them in Canada. They don't have them anywhere else except here in the United States. And if you think about it, on the very cover of the book for the Incoterms, it says trade terms for international and domestic use. Incoterms can be used domestically just as easily as they can be used internationally. Let's think about this. If you and I are in Europe, all right, let's just say you're in France, I'm in Germany, we do some business, they share a border. That is absolutely an international transaction because we are in different countries, but we are in the European Union, which is a customs zone. So if you ask the trucker's going to say, no, that's a domestic transaction. He goes, he doesn't stop at the border, right? Operationally, it's a domestic transaction, but legally, it's an international transaction. There is no export or import customs clearance. So let's think about this. Is there really a lot of difference between a German and French transaction as between one, say, Illinois to Wisconsin? No, there's no customs clearance, and so you can use Incoterms domestically because the thing about import and export clearance in the Incoterms is it says when applicable. So if I'm responsible for export customs clearance, I am when applicable. And it's not applicable domestically. So we can use Incoterms domestically as well. It's done all the time.
All right. So let's take this from another standpoint is that, again, let's take a air cargo move. All right. You've got now a container of freight that's moving air cargo, and obviously the container for aircraft is going to be much smaller than that of a 20 or 40 footer for ocean. But let's say we got a 5,000 pound container that's going on a aircraft and all of that, and we have that. In this same scenario, traditionally, what would you recommend as far as some of the Incoterms there?
Well, let's think about that for a minute. All right, let's go back and play with FCA.
Okay.
We have to remember that when we discuss Incoterms, they come in two parts. There is the three-letter designation FCA, and then there is the named place that occurs after FCA. So I can sell to you FCA my factory, or I can sell to you FCA port of export. And if you and I are going to be doing business by air freight, maybe I get better domestic trucking rates than your forwarder, and you would prefer to pick up the goods at, I'm sorry, pick up is the wrong word. You would prefer that I bring the goods to the port of export, the airport of export. Yeah. Right. So at that point, rather than me loading the goods onto your truck, I have to make the goods available to you, ready for unloading. Right. So that means my truck's going to back up to the airport, ready for unloading, and you're going to pick up the goods there because you happen to get very good freight rates by air. And so you said, no, I'm going to move the goods. I'm going to pick them up in your country. They're going to move on my contract.
Right.
Yeah. And so risk would then transfer at the port of export rather than at my place. Now, the problem here is that the United States is a big country. And there's a big difference between selling something FCA Chicago and FCA Miami and FCA Los Angeles. And the pre-carriage involved can significantly change the sale price to an American exporter who's selling goods, to their customer under FCA in the United States. We have 4 time zones alone just in the continental United States, right? And so, and if you're talking ocean freight, if you have a factory on the east coast of the United States, right, and you're going to sell me 5 containers of stuff, it's going to move by truck to a rail yard, it's going to move by train across the country, it's going to move to another rail yard, it's going to move by truck to the port of export. If we're talking air freight, you may say, you know what, I get better rates out of Miami than anywhere else. So Arthur, you got to move the goods to Miami. And so I'm going to need to know where in the United States you want me to bring the goods in order for me to build a sale price to you. I can't simply say, well, here's my price FCA. FCA what? FCA Chicago and FCA Miami, there's a big difference.
But then, oh no, we got a problem where, a ship is hung up, an airplane goes down, or something has been lost, or there's a train that has derailed, or whatever the case may be. And all that. So that's where, with those exceptions, and the proficiency of the folks in those areas that we just mentioned comes into play. So here's another question. Let's just say that a company does not have that kind of setup. Most don't, where there's this teamwork effort of these different entities.
Yeah.
With that said, what would you recommend? Let's just start with the compliance folks or the transportation folks. What would you recommend for somebody to do when it comes to the Incoterms? How, taking the information that we've got in some of these transactions, what would you recommend if you had to navigate through there and say, hey, we need to get together and probably work to minimize the risk that the company is seeing?
Well, training, of course, right? There should be some training, but the thing is, and here's the problem with training in any area. It doesn't matter if it's Incoterms or logistics or letters of credit. Invariably, at the end of the day, the person who takes the training says, oh my goodness, nobody else gets it. I mean, I get it, but nobody else does. And now I've got to go back to the office and explain it to everybody, and they're going to think I've got an agenda. And no, I'm just trying to make things right. And so, to get everybody on the same page, we all need to be in the same room and have this conversation and do some training about Incoterms and, not make assumptions.
Well, part of the challenge is going to be translating the complexity of these international transactions into terminology and phraseology that somebody that's not a compliance geek or whatever, or trade geek even, can understand it. Well, with that, let me just ask it this way then, is that as complex as it is, you mentioned the training. So that's, obviously that's the foundation of learning Incoterms, and then how to apply them is a whole different thing and all that. So I'm going to, you obviously have some very good information. I've seen some of this, folks, and I'm going to tell you what I'm about to open up here. He's got some books. Arthur has some books that are phenomenal, but I want you to stop for a minute to mention what, as far as these additional resources, more than just the Incobook term from ICC.
Yeah.
Tell me, it's like, do you have some recommendations here of some additional resources that will help somebody in the Incoterms? How's that softball for you?
Well, I've always wanted to be on a talk show and say the phrase, in my book. Shamelessly promote my book. So yes, in my book, okay. Making Money with Incoterms. And this is the second edition. This is on Incoterms 2020. We do have a class on this. We're going to be rolling this out in 2023. This is a book that says, all right, we've got the Incoterms. We understand what they are. Fine and dandy, but let's figure out how to use the Incoterms in negotiating purchases and sales, both domestic and international, with the intention of minimizing landed cost and maximizing profit. Okay. So this is
wait a minute. Repeat that. With the intention of what?
Minimizing cost and maximizing profit.
Well, you want to provide the service and all that. All right. So I'm going to pitch this back over now to Lalo, is that Lalo for the Global Training Center. And then, folks, I'm going to tell you, Global Training Center is our main sponsor here. And so I'm going to take a moment, but they provide phenomenal courses, great services and all that. But so Lalo, if somebody wants to learn about Incoterms from the basics to getting even more advanced, why don't you mention what you've got as far as at the Global Training Center that can be offered? I mean, there's other training programs, I get it,
Right.
but I mean, yours have been great. I know that.
Right. Well, we have several options. We have a Arthur and even yourself, Andy, have talked throughout the show about having several people involved in the process as to at least getting a clue or knowing what the heck is a Incoterm, even though they're not going to be the ones that are negotiating or applying it. So we have something that is an awareness class just to know, oh, that's what an Incoterms means. That's a short 1 hour class that somebody can take on their own pace and on their own time. It's recorded. And then Arthur and other instructors teach our basic, or not basic, but our in-depth Incoterms class. That's also a half-day class. That's live, interactive. People ask questions and everything. That could be done either at on a location somewhere or on a webinar. But then Arthur's added another class called Incoterms Strategies, which is applying, again, like he mentioned, on more of the strategies on maximizing, how'd you say it, Arthur?
Minimizing
Profit.
cost, maximizing
Yes.
profit. Yes.
I said it backwards somewhere. Well, anyway, yeah. And I know, Arthur, did you trademark that term repo, or did you try to trademark it, or
repo? You got it. Yes. Responsibility, possession, and ownership. Right.
an ownership, right? So REPO. So he uses that as part of his strategies as well on Incoterms, above and beyond what you might think. Oh, let's just use FCA or DDP or whatever, you know what I mean? And so, and taking all the consequences. But yeah, so that's what we offer. And again, as Arthur said, shameless plug, but that's what we're doing here. So
well, and again, the takeaway for folks, if you're new to the import, export, transportation, logistics, sourcing, purchasing, doesn't matter. If you are in management, that you have been now all of a sudden inheriting the compliance or import, export types of transactions, all that. Your takeaway, action wise, is get proficient, become proficient. Forgive my grammar here. Become proficient with the Incoterms. That is so paramount. Secondly, is once you become proficient with it, is also look at how to apply what you've been learning. One of the things that we usually do here is we like to ask our guests, and you have been very eloquent and great, so I appreciate you. If you had the opportunity to step in through a time machine or something and go back and talk to your 21-year-old self, what would you tell yourself?
At 21.
Wow. 21. We've had some people say, I wouldn't want to go back that far. I want to talk to my 30-year-old self or whatever. But
does buy Apple stock count?
Yes, it does.
It does. We've had a few say that. Buy Tesla, buy Apple, buy Microsoft. There you go.
Yes.
Yeah. But no, all kidding aside, actually, that's not kidding. I would love to have done that.
Yeah, me too.
Hindsight's 2020 on that.
Oh boy, that's a tough question. I really I don't know what I would say. I mean, my life has been anything but a straight line. I've lived very many places. I've had different careers. I've studied different things. When I was 21, I was studying anthropology. I was doing linguistics, which has nothing to do with Incoterms. Okay.
Other than how to properly pronounce them, right?
Yeah. I don't know if I'd say anything. I'd say just, you know what? Keep it up. You're doing.
Well, then, yeah, I was going to say, then your answer is do you. I mean, because you did you, Arthur, and you went through all those experiences. I mean, I know you personally, and I can attest that this guy is other than his age, he is that guy in that Dos Equis commercial, the world
the
most
world's greatest
interesting
man,
man.
or yeah,
You know,
most interesting man. That's it. Yeah,
Yeah, that's Arthur. I mean, he really is. It's great to sit with Arthur and just talk about just
That's
anything,
fantastic.
really. Yeah. But anyway.
And I'm blushing.
Well,
Okay.
Arthur,
Thank you.
it has been an absolute pleasure. I hope I haven't bent your ear too much there, and I hardly gave Lalo even a chance to jump in there. But
No,
I
don't
mean,
worry.
this is one of those is that I'm fascinated with Incoterms, and I'm more fascinated with the application thereof. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Well, anything and everything to do with business, I could talk all day. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a blast.
This is a great show for our last one for the year. So
it
it's
is.
like
And happy
we may
New
have
Year
to
to
break this
everyone,
one up
man.
as our last one and our first one. Who knows? So
Yeah,
who knows? Right, exactly. Well, I do want to say Happy New Year to both of you,
Thank you.
and
You too.
you know, I'm going to continue to do business with both of you, which is going to be fun until 2023, and we'll hit Arthur up when the Incoterms 2024 come out.
Okay.
The marketing people, anyway. But thank you, Arthur.
My pleasure. Thank you both as well.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.